In May 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz sent a private signal to his U-boat commanders still on patrol in the North Atlantic.
"The enemy holds every trump card," it read, "covering all areas with long-range air patrols and using location methods against which we still have no warning.
The enemy knows all our secrets and we know none of his." In that single month, Germany lost 41 submarines.
The worst month in the history of submarine warfare.
Dönitz withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic entirely, and he never regained the initiative. He would try again.
He would lose more men. And eventually he would write, in his post-war memoir, that Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. What he could not quite bring himself to explain in full was this, that the men who beat him were not primarily the strategists at Bletchley Park.
Not the admirals at Whitehall. Not even the codebreakers who had cracked Enigma, though all of those things mattered, and mattered enormously. What beat him was the courage of exhausted destroyer crews in Force 9 gales. Sonar operators staring at instruments for 12-hour stretches without sleep.
Aviators in TBF Avengers flying night patrols off escort carriers so small they pitched like corks in heavy North Atlantic swells. Germany had expected to find a merchant navy.
It found hunter-killer groups.
And in the post-war years, when surviving U-boat captains sat down to write their accounts and give their interviews and explain what had happened in those gray waters, their testimony kept converging on the same uncomfortable admission that they had never fully understood what the American sailor was capable of, until it was far too late to matter. In January 1942, 5 German U-boats crossed the Atlantic and found something their commanders had barely dared to hope for.
The American East Coast was lit up.
City lights, shore hotels, commercial signage, none of it blacked out, all of it throwing a pale glow across the water that silhouetted westbound merchant ships against the horizon in perfect relief. The ships were sailing alone, unescorted, on predictable routes, at predictable speeds. There were no convoy protocols. There were no coordinated patrol zones.
There were barely any anti-submarine aircraft.
U-boat commander Reinhard Hartigen, patrolling off New York and Cape Hatteras, described it in his war diary as a paradise. His boat alone sank 9 ships in a single patrol.
Dönitz called the operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat.
In the first 6 weeks, those 5 submarines sent nearly 400,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom without suffering a single loss.
By May 1942, U-boats operating off the American coast had sunk 87 Allied merchantmen at the cost of just 3 submarines. The failure was not one of courage or capability on the American side. It was a failure of preparation, of doctrine, and in part of institutional pride. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, initially refused British advice on convoy escorts and coastal blackouts, advice the Royal Navy had bought with years of hard experience and bitter losses. That refusal cost hundreds of merchant sailors their lives before the convoy system was finally organized and the coastal lights were dimmed. The men paying for that institutional lag were not admirals. They were merchant seamen, tanker crews, the men who kept the fuel and food and raw material flowing across the Atlantic to a Britain that needed over 1 million tons of imports per week just to remain in the war. The scale of what Dönitz had built was the reason the crisis was so severe. The U-boat service was not a small raiding force. At its peak it was a strategic instrument, and Dönitz had done the arithmetic with precision: sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, and Britain would be strangled before American shipyards could replace the losses. He was not wrong about the arithmetic. He was building toward that number in the early months of 1943. Wolf-pack tactics were the mechanism.
Groups of 12, 15, sometimes 20 submarines coordinating via encrypted radio, converging on convoys from multiple angles simultaneously, attacking at night on the surface where Allied sonar was useless.
In March 1943 alone, Wolfpack sent over 500,000 tons of shipping to the bottom.
The mid-Atlantic air gap, 1,000 miles of open ocean where no land-based aircraft could reach, was the Wolfpack sanctuary. Inside it, they operated with something approaching impunity. Churchill later wrote that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril. He was not being dramatic. He understood, as clearly as Dönitz did, exactly what the numbers meant. And yet within those same numbers was the fact that would eventually doom the U-boat service, a fact that neither Dönitz nor Hitler fully absorbed until it was irreversible. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, roughly 30,000 would die. A casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of any military on either side of the conflict. In early 1942, when the shooting season on the American coast was at its height, those losses lay in the future. The U-boat captains filing their patrol reports from Lorient and Brest were writing about kills, not casualties. By the end of 1943, the nature of those reports would change completely. The first U.S. Navy hunter-killer group went to sea in March 1943. At its center was USS Bogue, hull number CVE-9, a converted merchant vessel 495 feet long with a flight deck bolted on top, carrying 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and a handful of Wildcat fighters, screened by a ring of destroyers. She was not an impressive ship by the standards of fleet carriers. She rolled badly in heavy weather. Her flight deck was narrow enough that landing an aircraft in high seas required a kind of mechanical faith in the pilot's nerves. Her top speed was barely 17 knots slower than a surfaced U-boat running on diesels. She was also, within 6 months, going to be the deadliest anti-submarine platform in the Atlantic. The concept behind the hunter-killer group was straightforward in theory and extremely difficult in practice. Rather than waiting for U-boats to find convoys, take the fight to the submarines. Use carrier aircraft to search areas where signals intelligence indicated wolf packs were operating. When a submarine was located, fix its position, hold it down with surface escorts, and kill it. Offense, not defense. Seek out the submarines in the open ocean rather than wait for them to come to the merchant lanes. The aircraft that made this possible, the TBF Avenger, was a large, ungainly torpedo bomber that had been designed for fleet operations against surface ships. Repurposed for anti-submarine work, it proved extraordinarily effective, partly because of its range and payload, and partly because it could carry a weapon that gave it a capability no U-boat commander had prepared for. The Mark 24 Fido was the most carefully guarded American secret in the Atlantic War. Officially designated an anti-submarine weapon, unofficially called something considerably less printable by the aircrew who dropped it. It was an acoustic homing torpedo, the world's first, designed to be dropped ahead of a diving U-boat's propeller wash. Once in the water, it would steer itself toward the sound of the submarine screws, following it into the deep. A U-boat captain who crash-dived to escape an attacking aircraft had, up to the introduction of Fido, bought himself a measure of safety. Depth charges had to be dropped directly over the submarine's position, which required precise localization. A fast dive bought time, put the submarine below the reach of the first pattern, and often allowed it to maneuver clear while the surface escorts searched. Against Fido, diving was the worst possible response. The deeper and faster the U-boat went, the louder its screws sounded to the torpedo's acoustic seeker. There was no warning. There was no countermeasure, because no German intelligence service had confirmed the weapon's existence. The first a U-boat crew knew of it was when it hit. Fido worked in combination with a second capability that the Germans had equally failed to account for. High-frequency direction finding HF/DF, known among Allied sailors as Huffduff, allowed a surface ship to triangulate a U-boat's precise position the instant it transmitted a radio signal. The Wolfpack system required constant radio communication. Dönitz managed his patrols from shore, directing submarines to convoy positions, coordinating pack attacks, collecting patrol reports. Every transmission was a fix. A U-boat captain who radioed Dönitz's headquarters was, without knowing it, announcing his coordinates to any Allied vessel within range with Huffduff equipment. And by 1943, that meant most of the escort screen protecting the convoys he was hunting. Then there was the radar. The Medox detector, the electronic receiver German submarines relied on to warn them of approaching aircraft, could detect the type of radar Allied aircraft had been using in 1942. In 1943, Allied aircraft switched to centimeter-wave ASB Mark III radar. Medox was blind to it entirely. An Avenger equipped with ASV-3 could locate a surfaced U-boat in complete darkness from miles away, approach in silence, and have its bomb bay open before the submarine's crew heard anything at all. For technologies, Fido, HF/DF, centimeter radar, and escort carrier aviation converged in the same 6-month window. The effect was not additive. It was multiplicative. The hunter-killer groups found their most productive targeting in the mid-Atlantic, where Dönitz had stationed his Type 14 supply submarines, the so-called Milchkuh, the milk cow U-boats. These were the vessels that made extended Wolfpack operations possible: large, slow submarines carrying fuel, torpedoes, and provisions, rendezvousing with combat boats far from any Allied airfield to extend their time at sea. Destroy the milk cows, and the Wolfpacks lost their range. They would have to return to French ports to refuel, making themselves vulnerable during the transit, limiting the time they could spend in the hunting grounds. Guided to refueling rendezvous coordinates by decoded Enigma traffic, hunter-killer groups centered on Bogue, Card, Kor, and Croatan attacked the milk cows systematically through the summer and fall of 1943. Between May and December of that year, they sank 27 German submarines. USS Bogue's group alone accounted for 13 U-boat kills, a record for any single carrier hunter-killer group. Not a single convoy escorted by Bogue lost a ship to enemy action. By the end of the war, American hunter-killer groups had accounted for roughly 60% of all U-boats destroyed by U.S. forces in the Atlantic. The men running those kills were, most of them, civilians who had been in uniform for less than 2 years. Sonar operators trained in crash programs. Destroyer captains learning anti-submarine doctrine from the British on the job. Avenger pilots who had qualified for carrier operations in the North Atlantic on ships that pitched 30 degrees in heavy swells. They ran the patrols on 4 hours of sleep per watch. They dropped depth charges in seas that made standing upright on the stern a genuine hazard. They flew night patrols off flight decks lit only by a single row of deck lights, in weather that grounded aircraft at any shore installation in the theater. They did not come from a warrior tradition. They came from the same America that Dönitz had dismissed during the opening months of the war, the same country whose unblacked-out coastline had looked, in January 1942, like easy prey. In May 1943, Dönitz faced a set of numbers he could not argue with. 41 submarines lost in a single month. Not spread across a year, not accumulated over a campaign season, 41 boats in 31 days, each one carrying between 40 and 60 men, most of whom did not survive the sinking. Against those losses, the Wolfpacks had sunk 50 Allied ships in the same period, a kill ratio that, in early 1942, would have been celebrated as a triumph. By May 1943, it represented strategic failure. The Allies were building merchant ships faster than the submarines could sink them, and losing U-boats at a rate that no training pipeline could replace. Dönitz sent his signal, "The enemy holds every trump card," and ordered the Wolfpacks out of the North Atlantic. He framed it publicly, and even in some internal communications, as a temporary withdrawal. A tactical pause while German engineers developed countermeasures. New radar detectors. The acoustic torpedo, the Zonkönig, designed to home in on the propeller noise of pursuing destroyers and kill the escorts themselves. Snorkel breathing tubes that would allow submarines to run their diesels while submerged, eliminating the need to surface to recharge batteries and reducing their exposure to aircraft. Each of these developments was real. Each of them bought the U-boat service a measure of additional capability. And each of them, in turn, was answered. When Germany introduced the Zonkönig acoustic torpedo, the weapon designed to kill destroyer escorts, to turn the tables on the hunters by targeting the ships pursuing them, the Americans deployed the Foxer within months. The Foxer was a towed noise-making device, a mechanical decoy dragged behind the stern of a destroyer escort, generating propeller sounds louder than the ship itself. The Zonkönig, homing on the loudest signal, chased the decoy instead of the hull. When U-boat captains, increasingly desperate against carrier aircraft, tried mounting heavier anti-aircraft armament and fighting back on the surface rather than diving, the response was methodical. Carrier aircraft stayed at higher altitudes, used radar to locate the submarine before it could see them, and either dropped FIDO ahead of the eventual dive or coordinated with surface escorts to saturate the position with depth charges. The submarines that chose to fight on the surface found that a U-boat's anti-aircraft battery could not compete with coordinated air and surface attack. The ones that chose to dive found FIDO. There was no good option. That was precisely the point. U-boat commander Jürgen Essen, one of the more reflective survivors of the Atlantic campaign, wrote after the war, "The submarine war is in a way like big game hunting, but within seconds the hunter becomes the hunted and has to run for his life." It was an accurate description of what the American hunter-killer groups had systematically engineered, the complete psychological and tactical inversion of every assumption the U-boat service had built its doctrine around. The wolf pack had been designed to be the predator, patient, invisible, striking from darkness before the prey knew it was being stalked.
By the second half of 1943, that dynamic had reversed.
U-boat captains were checking their radar detectors compulsively, knowing their METOX was no longer reliable. They were surfacing to radio Dönitz and knowing, or suspecting, that the transmission might be giving away their position. They were diving to avoid aircraft and wondering whether something in the water below them was already tracking the sound of their screws.
Dönitz continued the campaign because Hitler demanded it, and because stopping entirely would have freed Allied anti-submarine forces for other theaters. But no German naval officer still believed, after the summer of 1943, that the Battle of the Atlantic could be won. The question had shifted from victory to how many Allied resources could be kept occupied by a campaign that was, by any strategic measure, already lost. The numbers accumulated without mercy. In the spring of 1942, U-boats were sinking Allied ships at a rate that genuinely threatened the outcome of the war. By the end of 1943, escort carrier groups were destroying submarines at a rate that made continued offensive operations statistically suicidal for the men inside them. The casualty rate in the U-boat service in the final 2 years of the war climbed toward figures that commanders in any other branch of any other military would have cited as grounds to suspend operations entirely. Dönitz's own post-war essay on the conduct of the naval war, published by U.S. Naval Intelligence in 1946, returned repeatedly to what Germany had failed to anticipate, that Allied sea power, in the specific combination of carrier aviation, surface escorts, and signals intelligence, had proved impossible to overcome. He wrote about strategic miscalculation. He wrote about technological surprise. He wrote about the overwhelming productive capacity of American industry. He did not write about underestimating the American sailor. The silence on that point was its own kind of answer. The men who won the Battle of the Atlantic never got a parade. There was no famous ship at the center of it, no single battle that schoolchildren would memorize, no moment clean enough to fit on a monument. The hunter-killer carrier groups, the destroyer escort crews, the sonar operators, the Avenger pilots flying night patrols off pitching flight decks in the North Atlantic winter, they didn't sink a battleship or storm a beach or liberate a city. They protected a flow. They kept open the line of supply across which everything else the Allied war effort needed had to pass: the fuel, the food, the ammunition, the men, the machines that made every other campaign in every other theater possible. Without the Atlantic Sea lanes, there was no North Africa, no Sicily, no Normandy, no Rhine crossing. Without the merchant convoys arriving intact, Britain could not sustain itself, let alone serve as the staging ground for the largest military operation in Western history. The Battle of the Atlantic was not one campaign among many. It was the campaign on which all the others depended. And it was won, in the end, not by a single decisive stroke, but by thousands of individual acts of persistence, by men who went back out in force 9 gales after returning from a patrol, because the boats were there and the sea lanes had to be kept open. The intelligence thread was real and it mattered. Enigma decrypts routed convoys away from wolf pack positions and guided hunter-killer groups toward milk cow rendezvous coordinates. Without Bletchley Park, the campaign would have been longer, costlier, and less certain in its outcome. That is not a small thing. But every Enigma decrypt still had to be acted on by human beings in the water, in the weather, under conditions that tested the limits of what men can sustain. A signals intelligence report pointing to a U-boat's position still required a destroyer crew to close that position in darkness, in heavy seas, in a ship whose hull vibrated from its own depth-charge detonations, not knowing whether the next torpedo in the water was already tracking the sound of their propellers. The intelligence told them where to go. It could not go there for them. Dönitz admitted Germany lost. He reconstructed the reasons carefully, in the language of strategy and technology and industrial capacity. What he never quite said directly, what his post-war silence on the subject of the American sailor suggested he understood but found difficult to write, was simpler than any of his strategic analysis. He had sent his submarines against something he had not prepared for. Not just a navy, not just a technology, not just an industrial base. An institutional capacity to learn under pressure, to absorb losses and adapt faster than those losses could be replaced, to take civilians who had been fishermen and factory workers and radio operators 18 months earlier and turn them into the most effective anti-submarine force the war produced. The Americans had not built a perfect machine. They had built something more durable than that, a machine that got better every time it failed. The surviving U-boat captains kept arriving at the same admission not because they were gracious in defeat, but because the evidence was undeniable. From the moment the hunter-killer groups found their stride in the summer of 1943, no wolf pack could operate in the central Atlantic without looking over its shoulder. The predators had become prey. The men who made that happen came home, most of them, to no particular recognition. They went back to being whoever they had been before the war, before the North Atlantic taught them what they were capable of. They had gone out in ships that weren't built for war, in weather that wasn't fit for sailing, against an enemy that had been doing this longer and had designed every element of its doctrine around the assumption that they would fail. They didn't fail. They never got a parade for it. But the war got one.